Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And I am once again at my remote location. I'm not at my usual place. I'm at my vacation place at my friend's place in Waterloo, and we are rejoined by my good friend Jay Watts. Jay is the central organizer of the Communist Party of Canada. He was a brilliant guest last time around, which is why I wanted to have him, back. And this is going to be a first of a series of conversations all about, not just communism, but communist states. And Jay is going to be, doing some myth busting and pushing back against a lot of the propaganda when it comes to the Korean War and stuff like that, the Vietnam War. But on this particular edition, we're going to be talking all about China because China's been in the news lately, and it's kind of scary that the powers to be think that they can do a war on China, and much of the left is also going along with what Eve Engler would say, marching to the imperial beats of Canada and so forth. So, Jay, first of all, thank you for coming back on 1+1.
Hello, thank you for having me.
It's an honor to have you back. And yeah, Jay, so the last time we talked, we actually did talk a bit about China. And before I ask this first question, what are some of your thoughts on the rise of Sinophobia? And it's funny because 4 years of Donald Trump, we were subjected to anti-Russia / Putin derangement syndrome, which merged with people's anti-Donald Trump derangement syndrome, which was a terrible combination of nobody was able to have a rational thought on anything and everything. But towards the end of the Trump administration, we've now been seeing anti-China derangement syndrome. And what are some of your before I ask my first question, what are some of your thoughts on that?
So I think there's been a lot of groundwork prepared, at least in Canada, for where we're at right now. So, for example, earlier this week on Monday, the House of Commons here, our legislature, which voted 266-0 to declare what they propose is happening, or purport to know is happening in Xinjiang as constituting genocide. I think most of the liberals who were in Parliament at the time voted for it as well, but I think most of the cabinet, with the exception of Marc Garneau, who's the current foreign affairs minister, just didn't appear for the vote. I think recognizing it was put forward by the Conservative Party, the NDP. Everybody in the NDP overwhelmingly voted for it, despite, I'm sure, probably not very many of them knowing how to even spot that place on the map. But maybe they saw something in the BBC or something like that.
I was about to say probably reading the usual NGO suspects, Amnesty International, human rights fraud, or looking at whatever Democracy Now! Is broadcasting these days, which is overwhelming. Yeah.
So we got to this point, there's a long history of xenophobia in Canada in particular. A lot of Chinese migrants were brought over and used essentially as a form of slave labor. It was paid, but it was pretty indentured to build the Trans-Canadian Railroad. In the 19th century, there was a head tax put on them. There's been a long history of anti-Asian and in particular China, racism directed against Chinese people in this country. My first experience, I guess, would be with it around maybe in the 90s, with the handover, as it's termed, of Hong Kong back to China. The decolonization, really. So with that, a number of people came from Hong Kong to settle in Canada, primarily in Vancouver, but many in Toronto and other cities as well, where there already was a decent population. But at that time, there was a lot of just outright xenophobic racism in newspapers, people calling Vancouver Honcouver, you know, right wing.
Even though these even though, like, I mean, I assume that, like, many of the people who moved out of Hong Kong when Hong Kong was given back to uh to the Chinese, I mean, weren't many of these immigrants, like, kind of like fleeing because they thought that they were going to be persecuted by the CPC, and then they're met with, like, with with xenophobia, Sinophobia, even though, like, people from Hong Kong, I mean, politically wise, a little bit of, like, difference with political cultures are a bit, distinguishable from those from mainland China, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of the people who were coming were wealthier, were considering it just as an economic thing, not even necessarily a political thing. I mean, that's the other thing to recognize is that the sort of quasi-democratic system that is in place right now, which is ostensibly a holdover from the British system, was only established by the governor of Britain, a white man who was in Thatcher's cabinet, a few years before the handover. Like, they ran it like a dictatorship for the entire time the British ran it, and what they left as they sort of went out the back door was a system designed to sort of like fuck with the People's Republic of China when it resumed control over, or sovereignty over Hong Kong. So a lot of the people who were leaving would probably even be politically attuned to the people who were being racist against them. But racists aren't always totally up on their politics. So, anyways, that was quite a big feature of the '90s and into the 2000s. There was a lot of blame put on them for, like, housing prices inflating and stuff, as if it was just a matter of swarms of Chinese people coming over and taking their homes and stuff like that. And I mean, that's actually been a feature up until recently too, is that there's this sort of, well, there's two assertions. One assertion is that for whatever reason, the Chinese government itself is orchestrating some sort of, like, takeover of the housing market. There's a lot of money leaving China, and this has been the focus of Xi Jinping's anti-corruption strategy. But the reality is that money that's leaving is capital flight. Sometimes it's embezzled. It's way more in the People's Republic of China's interest to to track down people who, if they are buying stuff in Canada, it's in their interest to get them to stop. And so every time this is brought up, I say, well, if you're interested in getting, dirty money or whatever, or this money out of these housing markets that you think is inflating, well, then you should be cooperating with the Chinese government to stop this money from flowing. But that's not really what's happening. Mostly the myth of international buyers is there is international capital coming in. It's not all just from China, but it's coming in because capitalism is stagnating and because housing speculation is the one place you can make a lot of money. You're not going to build a factory, make some product that maybe no one will buy or anything like that, put all this money into it 5 years, when you can just throw whatever $20 million into Toronto and turn that into $40 million in a year. So that's really what's driving the speculation. But this is so mixed up with anti-Chinese racism that it's some people have pushed against it, but it's not a very popular thing to speak up for to say, well, actually it's mostly Canadian banks that are orchestrating this sort of housing bubble. So that's all mixed together. And then as well, we have, of course, the kidnapping on the orders of Donald Trump of Meng Wanzhou as the CFO of Huawei. The U.S. government approached a number of other Western countries, including NATO countries, in order to request that they perform some sort of kidnapping like this. They all said no, but the Canadian government went along with it. She was arrested a couple of years ago in Vancouver. She was actually transitioning to a flight to Mexico or something like that. Anyways, so ostensibly in retaliation, and probably too, the Chinese government arrested Michael Michael Spavor or Michael Kovrig. Sorry, I'm forgetting their names. They're called colloquially called the two Michaels in Canadian media, although no one really cares too much about them. It's been funny seeing I mean, Canadian media is pretty awful, and generally lots of Canadians go along with stuff, but it's just it's been funny to see how much they're trying to make this two Michaels thing happen, but there's no, like, people aren't really picking it up. There's other things in their life they're worrying about right now. So occasionally on the internet, you'll get some like angry old racist who's like crying about the two Michaels. So these two people, one of them, Spavor, was working as a tour agency guide connected to the North Korea DPRK. The other, Michael Kovrig, was working for International Strategy Group. He was a former diplomat with the Canadian Embassy, no longer a diplomat. That's very critical to note. He was working unregistered in China. That international strategy or international crisis group, is funded by NATO governments. It receives the majority of its funding from Australia. So
continue. Yeah.
Him and so I mean, this guy was also going to then work with the other Michael on something related to DPRK. That's, I think, why they were picked up. Anyways, I think when China arrested them, this is pretty low hanging fruit. I mean, these guys are kind of like obvious spies. You know, like the one guy, Michael Kovrig. I mean, his boss went on a famous political talk show like the day after he was arrested, and the host on CBC and state media here was like, well, what was he doing in China? The line was, oh, he was doing unregistered research work, contacting dissident ethnic populations. It was like, okay, so he's a spy. Like, that's the definition of a spy. You're an agent of some other governments going into not registering yourself as that foreign agent, not letting them know. That's what he got picked up on. So I mean, it's obvious. Like, I think they were trying to send a message at that point. I like, some people will say, oh no, it's no coincidence. I'm not that, whatever. I think they are connected. It's pretty obvious. But trying to say, like, look, come on, this is, those two Michaels or whatever are not anywhere near as important a figure as Meng Wanzhou is in terms of Huawei.
But Meng Wanzhou, I mean, there's all sorts of complicated stuff related to, like, whether she violated America's, like, sanctions regime on Iran and so forth like that. But it's pretty obvious. I mean, like the Americans picked up, the Americans and Canadians picked up this private Chinese business woman. Now, how closely connected her company is to the Chinese government, it doesn't really matter because it's a different system there compared to, what we have, like, in North America. But it's pretty obvious, like, the Americans, capture her. This is part of a larger, geopolitical strategy started by the Obama administration, which we're going to get into later in the program, called the pivot to Asia, where America and its allies want to basically say to the Chinese, we only want you for your cheap labor. You're not allowed to expand your economy, like, at all. And we want to keep you in your place. So we're going to surround you by, like, military bases, and us kidnapping your business, your businesswoman is part of it. And the Chinese probably would have never, captured these two Michaels. This is just sort of like their tit for tat over what the Americans and the Canadians did to Meng Wanzhou. And luckily, the Hamilton Coalition Against the War, very, 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 very great anti-imperialist group in your neck of the wood, has been campaigning to set her free. It was a bit annoying, though, when the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute hosted a huge online event to discuss this. Nikki Ashton, the very popular left-wing, the very popular, member of parliament of the NCP, more on, like, the leftish end of the NCP, was supposed to be there. Paul Manley of the Green Party was there, although he sort of was engaging in a lot of China also has an evil empire. They're a rival to our oligarchs, and and we should only be freeing Meng Wanzhou once the Chinese have freed our diplomats and all sorts of stuff like that. And your thoughts on that?
I think the Greens are like the new leader, Annamie Paul. She's also made some recent statements. So like, I think her big proposal was, oh, we shouldn't have the Olympics in China, blah blah blah. She's connected to. I mean, through her husband was connected to the Colombian government negotiation team with the peace talks with FARC, the guerrillas in Colombia. As somebody else has pointed out on Twitter, her husband also had worked with the right-wing government in Bolivia, the pre-Morales government, one of the neoliberal governments. So, I mean, Manley has some sort of foreign policy cred because he was famously sort of fucked around, pardon my language, by the NDP for pro-Palestinian positions, and his father was on one of the flotillas, and he wanted the NDP to speak up against it, which they didn't. But I mean, he's just regurgitating sort of this soft left, boring nonsense, which is, well, China's really bad too. It's useless. I mean, and I think he probably. So there was a bunch of media, like Ashton pulled out of it because there was a bunch of media about a statement that she had made just before it. So I remember that I was on that call too. There was quite a few people participating, probably primarily like Canadian media, in order to like have a gotcha moment on Nikki Ashton, who didn't participate. Somebody read out a statement for her. She said it was because she didn't want to make the focus on her. I don't think that's true. I think that's as we've seen. Leah Gazan, who's another NDP MP, who's ostensibly on the left of the NDP, was supposed to speak on another event, which was against the purchase of fighter jets, the proposed Liberal government purchase of fighter jets. She was pulled from that, and in her place was Randall Garrison, the not ostensibly the right wing.
Oh, I remember that. I was actually, I was. Yeah, I wasn't like a participant of it, but like I viewed it. Randall Garrison was, he was just reading out like one NATO bullshit line after the other, and like saying like it was ridiculous. This guy claiming to be an environmentalist, and yet he supports fighter jets. And he wants a war with Russia over over disputed territories in the Arctic.
It was like, and
I was watching this with like my mouth with my jaws dropped open, and then like Elle Jones later kind of pushed back against his warmongering with her wonderful like poetry and her and her truth telling, and like I had to, and then like I was just like sort of like typing in the comment sections, pushing back against Randall's complete distortion of history when it came to what's been taking place in Ukraine. But again, I mean, and this is a whole another subject that we definitely have to talk about in the future. It's this sort of boring social democratic like warmongering, the social imperialist stuff that's been going on, which I have no time for anymore. And these people who think that just because they read Animal Farm in 1984, they know they're like a scholar on the USSR and so forth. And then then it's, if it's not that, it's like these kind of Noam Chomsky, Amnesty International people who have to denounce both sides. We have to denounce both sides, and these are two rival imperialists, the Chinese against the West, and it's yawn.
So I think in the past, you could depend a little bit more on NDP MPs. Not Sven Robinson's a famous one who would even take a stand against stuff that his party was saying. He famously went along with the bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, but when hearing what was going on, actually traveled there, apologized, changed his position. He advocated for a lot of other good stuff. So I think there's a sort of a reflex, which is understandable, which is that you want parliamentary allies, and the peace movement needs parliamentary allies because they can get on TV. Ken Stone might be able to get on the Hamilton Courier, or the Hamilton Spectator rather, but he's not necessarily going to be on CBC, speaking about the issues of the day. But if an NDP MP or a Green MP, or actually shockingly, some of the best stuff that's coming out right now on foreign policy, especially related to Canadian mining, is coming from a Bloc Québécois MP, which is interesting given the sort of like right-wing shift of that party. But that might just be related to the individual's politics or his constituency, or that there is there's a more left-leaning sort of nature of Quebec politics. Anyway, so I understand the impulse for the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, for World Beyond War, all these organizations to get parliamentary figures. But as we see, the best case scenario is something Nikki Ashton pulls out and says as a statement and still kind of supports things. The worst case scenario is Paul Manley gets on your fucking thing and yammers on. No, sorry, that's second worst case scenario. Worst case scenario is they replace it with Randall Garrison, who goes on about fucking Putin. Or the worst part was like, I know you probably won't like what I have to say, and he goes on this little story to give his like peace activist bona fides, which is this story about in the 80s he was in Nicaragua and he helped orchestrate some sort of fucking Christmas Day truce thing, and and so that shows that he likes peace. And it's like, dude, this is the fucking Sandinistas fighting like fascists, and your big thing is like, no, I'd be happier if you. I want them to win, man. I want the Sandinistas to win and like topple their fascist government and defeat the Contras that are coming back against them. I don't really care that you did this fucking Christmas Day peace truce thing. This is like a national liberation struggle. Like, ugh. Anyway, so that was supposed to like make everybody be like, oh, look, he's one of us. He's just got a different view on this. And then he just went on like, yeah, and he said stuff like this before. This is the NDP's line, is the NDP wants more defense spending, no matter what, some lefty NDP MP on Twitter is going to say. The line is they want more defense spending. They want fighter jets. They want new fighter jets. And they're in favor of this war against China. I mean, I guess when we say Cold War, maybe people who didn't, I grew up at the tail end of it. Maybe people who don't do put a little bit too much about the Cold War. I mean, the Cold War was really a series of like hot incidents and violence and genocide like that took an anti-communist crusade that took a place across the globe. And I'm glad to see a book like the Jakarta Method, which like sort of outlines the counterinsurgent, like anti-communist genocidal tactics that were used on the communist and Chinese population in Indonesia in the 60s, is sort of getting out there a little bit more, and people making those connections to what happened in El Salvador and Central America in the 80s, that the U.S. actively encouraged genocidal policies against left-wing movements, left-wing parties, left-wing organizations, or people deemed to be left-wing.
Yeah.
So when our party warns against a new Cold War, we're not saying, oh, it's just going to be, a détente between two rival blocs. No, this is very dangerous. And China is a nuclear superpower as well, just like the USSR was. The U.S. is in a bad economic spot. I don't think it's getting any better. Capitalism is stagnating. Like, it's a Cold War now versus the Cold War previously is going to be a lot more violent, a lot more deadly, a lot more dangerous, because at least in that period, capitalism was sort of on the post-war upswing, right? That depended, that was fed by the violence that they were causing into the destruction of the left everywhere at the same time. But now capitalism is stagnating, is falling, is unable to deal with something as simple as a pandemic. When you see a country like Vietnam, which is ostensibly poor, able to like deal with it very quickly. I'm in one of the richest countries on earth. We're still like this is like we're going into the second year of this pandemic, and it's just the system is functionally unable to deal with things that, just as a measure of even long-term economic thinking, should make sense to it. So if you put the major imperialist capitalist country, which is just rotting, you put it in a Cold War situation, it's going to be even more aggressive. It's a dying animal, and we really have to like look at this. So people are like, oh, Meng Wanzhou, she's a capitalist, Huawei, blah 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 blah. Fine, fair enough. I don't care. It doesn't really matter if it was Jack Ma, it was anybody else. The issue, well, there's two issues. The issue, first of all, is that we're orchestrating a political kidnapping on behalf of Donald Trump, who just turned around and was like, "Oh yeah, if we go easy on these negotiations in NAFTA, like maybe we'll release Meng Wanzhou. Wouldn't you like that? Like openly admitting, like we kidnapped this person." The second issue is, as you were right to point out, is that she was picked up for violating sanctions that, first of all, are illegal, that the U.S. put on Iran, and second of all, that the Canadian government wasn't even participating in. This should be a massive issue, just because basically you're doing the bidding of the United States on this issue. So I've gone to Cuba a number of times. There's many Canadians who've gone to Cuba who ostensibly violate U.S. sanctions on Cuba, who have business relationships with there. If the United States decides that they don't like, what I'm saying, or they don't like, well, probably I'm not big enough, but somebody else who does business, will the Canadian government go and just arrest that person on behalf of the U.S. government? The precedent is there. It's fucking crazy.
And I have to emphasize this before we get more into the history of China, and you, I think, are the best person to explain to people how the system actually works, because folks, you cannot be an environmentalist and advocate for militarism, any form of militarism. You cannot be an environmentalist, let alone an eco-socialist, and be advocating for the pivot to Asia, NATO building up on Russia's borders and stuff like that, and advocating for fighter jets. And okay, I'm not a fan of the current Chinese system. I'm not even a fan of Putin. But for F's sakes, do you guys want to live on Earth? Yeah. Do you want to live on Earth? Do you want to actually see countries work with one another, nation to nation, and have your scientists be able to work with Russian scientists and Chinese scientists to say, okay, how are we going to sustainably live on Earth, or at least find a way to extend the planet's life support? Because I'm of the opinion that we've kind of destroyed the planet beyond even fixing it. But as Eve was saying to me when I interviewed him, after the Green Party debate on foreign policy, he was saying that he was explaining to me how counterproductive it is having political parties and having a supposedly green party be advocating for a new Cold War with China by supporting the pivot to Asia, or de facto supporting the pivot to Asia, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is you're in Europe, and the history of green parties sort of sliding very extremely to the right. Maybe a lot of them, their commitment to peace was sort of like an anti-nuclear commitment that came out of the 80s and those movements and stuff. So it wasn't necessarily informed by a broader idea of what peace constitutes, of a notion of imperialism or anything like that. So I don't think, in some ways, I don't think I think they are betraying the basic premise behind the green thing, which is that, yeah, a buildup of militarism. I mean, we know that the U.S. military is the greatest polluter on Earth. It's just it's beyond anything. So that in that sense, it's a betrayal of their principles. But in another sense, I mean, this is just Greens. They're it's a sort of vague idea. I don't know. But yeah, it is counterproductive still at the same time to have these parties which situate themselves on the left move lockstep with the Conservative Party of Canada to say, oh, we're not doing enough against China, et cetera, et cetera. I also think just in it's the Liberal Party, I think, is very split on this issue, which is why, I think they know that they have to toe a line between, okay, we've got to do what the U.S. says, but we also recognize what China is, and Canada is, yeah, we're rich, yeah, we're an imperialist power, but we're not the United States, right? And I think there are business people, certainly former Foreign Affairs Minister John Manley, who was Foreign Affairs Minister in the 90s, I believe, and maybe early 2000s. He's spoken out. He's represents sort of more of the business corporate wing of international corporate wing of the Liberal Party. Spoken out very intensely against Chrystia Freeland when she was foreign affairs minister. Said, basically it was her word, like what she did during that time was destroy the ability of what Canada was formerly able to do, which is go into places where the United States couldn't, do some business, plus also kind of like, say, hey, like US don't, like, we can do this and we'll tell you some stuff, like work as sort of a middle power kind of thing is what he put it like. And Chrystia Freeland destroyed any possibility of a relationship with Russia, with the Magnitsky sanction stuff, doing the same with China. Like, obviously, as that State Department memo that I found when she was declared the new foreign affairs minister, the U.S. State Department put out a memo which is like, Canada adopts an America first foreign policy. So John Manley and certain people within the party, the Liberal Party, know that where she is taking the party is aligning it far too much with the United States and its aims, and that the United States is dying as a superpower, is volatile, is not worthy of even like more of long-term capitalist engagement, I think, although you still have to be there. So and that's taken a former ambassador to China, John McCollum. He was sort of like shit on by the Liberal Party. He's also a liberal, because I think he had said something to the effect of that Meng Wanzhou should be released, et cetera, et cetera. John Manley also had said that. So it's actually, it's in a way, this goes back to like, the usefulness of NDP MPs and Green Party MPs and stuff like that, is that when they say these sorts of things, like what Nikki Ashton said, which was basically what John Manley said, she got jumped on right away. It's almost better to have a Liberal MP who represents like the business wing or something, because then the Globe and Mail takes them seriously and says, oh yes, that's actually a good idea, and they get treated more prominently. Jeffrey Sachs, for example, who's at the World Bank and orchestrated the destruction of the Soviet Union in the 90s. He was even like on, and I think he's changed a bit, or ostensibly, he was even on the side of releasing her and had a big thing in the Globe and Mail. So, I mean, I guess that's a broader question of strategy and stuff like that in terms of the peace movement. But for myself, I'm more interested in hearing what they have to say, because I think it goes a little further, rather than, the NDP, which just falls on its face, and the Greens, which want to like prove that they're adults and they too can go along with Amnesty International or BBC or whatever. Anyways, I wanted to go back to the one thing.
Go ahead.
Which is that Pivot to Asia, and obviously you've seen it too. It's the Coming War on China, John Pilger's documentary, which I think is just for anybody. And this is way, I think it's 2011 that he made it. It's been quite a while.
Yeah.
Anybody who wants to like figure out what the hell is going on, or maybe it's a little after that, just watch that documentary. It shows. Well, he was predicting where we're going to be, which is today, and somewhere worse too as well. It's great. I mean, it's a little meandering. I think it seems like he started a documentary on the like nuclear testing site in the Pacific, and was like halfway through it, and then was like, oh no, I'll do this other documentary. But it's good, and it's really solid.
No, and I love John Pilger. It's certainly not my favorite, of the fantastic body of work. But yeah, a lot of times when I get into online squabbles with people who are saying we must do something about China, I say to them, okay, here's a bunch of stuff from Minpress News, here's a bunch of stuff from the Grey Zone, and here's John Pilger's documentary. Have fun. Because, And what's interesting about the documentary is that, he spends, the first half talking about, the U.S. Actually using nuclear weapons on, the Marshall Islands just to see what nuclear weapons do. And I think what he was trying to do, in the first half of that documentary, before he talks about, the Cold War on China and, this new Cold War on China, is that people, this fear of China or even this fear of Russia, guys, the Chinese never used nuclear weapons on people just to see what nuclear weapons do to people. The U.S. did it on Hiroshima, Nagasaki, did on the Marshall Islands, and it still does, and then still uses monstrous weapons of mass destruction, whether it's giving it to Iraq to use on the Iranians, of course, Vietnam, and I think even Korea. Didn't the U.S. also use chemical weapons on the Koreas as well?
Yeah, so actually that's a really interesting story related to our party, which was our party has close relations with the Canadian Peace Congress, which also still exists, works with Hamilton Coalition to stop the war. So the president during the time of the Korean War, which the Canadian government participated in, was Stephen Endicott, was a minister, and he had went over via China to Korea and found evidence that they were using biological weapons, that the U.S. was using biological weapons, put out a pamphlet about it, which I think is still available via PDF, and was going to do a speaking tour around Canada based on it. The prime minister at the time, which I think was Lester Pearson, which Eve Engler has written really good on, especially getting rid of the notion that he was some sort of great peacekeeper. Yeah. At that time was furious about it. In a private cabinet meeting, was proposing that he be charged with treason, which would carry an automatic death penalty. Instead of it, and during that cabinet meeting, they decided, okay, we're not going to do that, but we'll go about trying to destroy his reputation, making sure that he wasn't able to speak, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and this I'm trying to think how it ties in, but yeah. Anyway, so that's what was revealed. I think there was a couple of other, maybe in the States, somebody else also tried to publish about it. Usually, people connected the peace movement, which was connected to communist parties at the time. But yeah, they were using biological weapons illegally against Korean and Chinese soldiers during that war, and the Canadian government fully had knowledge of it. Stephen Endicott's son, who I believe just passed away, or no, sorry, James Endicott. Sorry, that's the guy. Stephen Endicott is his son. He just passed away about 2 years ago, I think. He wrote a book about this. He's a professor at York University here, which is pretty good. So I recommend if you just Google Endicott Korean War, biological warfare, you'll find all that stuff. But basically, he did a bunch of research and vindicated, and said, yeah, this is actually the fact. That's what happened. Is vindicated his father.
All right, so on to the issues at hand in this all China edition. So the first question, first official question, then I wanted to ask is, and apologies in advance because some of these questions I asked last time, so it might be a bit repetitive, but I think it's important to ask them again just to clarify for people. So first question I wanted to ask is, can you explain the Chinese system to an audience which is very hostile to communism, or those who claim to be Marxist but decry the system, the system of China, which allows a form of the free market? And there are people who also criticize China because China's used cheap labor, and they say that the workers don't have any power over China. So can you talk about that, as well as how the press is? How the Chinese press is conducted, and how much does the government provide for its people, and how taxation is done in China?
Okay, that's a lot of questions. I guess I'll start with, I think so. China around in the 70s sort of moved away from the traditional, more Marxist-Lenin as well. The more traditional sort of socialist model of development, industrial development that they were doing at that time. I think which formed the basis of what modern China is now. They were probably, I think David Harvey's written on this, even if they still went with the model that they had at the same time, they would still be something of a power now. So it's not necessarily that these market-oriented reforms took them away from a crash that was going to happen. But I think there's a lot of current Communist Party members who would say that it did, looking at the experience of the Soviet Union. So one of the big problems with the Soviet Union was the problem of technology transfer, was that sort of after World War II, you have a devastated economy. like certain level of like stagnation. The Soviet system was capable of building itself up as it did during the period of collectivization, during the 30s, understanding that the war was coming, like the just manpower and development and stuff like that was incredibly rapid. But after World War II, you have a problem, which is that you're missing basically a generation of people who are supposed to be the people who are working in these factories or developing, et cetera, et cetera. Plus, you have a problem now with the advance of the Cold War that there are now hostile relations between Western European countries who bore almost not that much of a chunk of war, and they have advanced technology that you need. But it's very rare that you're going to have a friendly sort of government that you have any relations with. So they had to develop their own stuff. And in those conditions, it wasn't the best. I mean, and so you can look at the Soviet Union, you can say that what the Chinese saw there was they saw, okay, we're also, I mean, in 1949, at the time of the revolution, China was, I think, the second poorest country on earth. This is in comparison to when, anyways, so it's still functionally a very poor country. Looking at the Soviet Union, I think in the 70s, they said, okay, the problem of technology transfer is one. First of all, we have an adversarial relationship. This is related to the Sino-Soviet split in the 50s and stuff like that, which is also related to nuclear weapons. Anyways, the whole thing there. But what does China have? China has a massive population. So I think in my mind, I think that the Chinese said, okay, we will allow a certain amount of exploitation of our workers, while still being able to guarantee certain social services, et cetera, because that will provide.
So is that sorry to interject, but is that where the cheap labor comes in, like? Where you have like your Walmarts of the world, your sweatshops of the world, your Microsofts and whatnot, all coming into China. They are exploiting the workers. They are exploiting the workers for cheap labor, and that's part of how China's economy did rise, because the Chinese. Yeah, continue on.
Yeah, of course, allowed that exploitation. That exploitation is twofold, though. That exploitation, without that, you don't have a company like Huawei. You don't have these larger technology companies, advanced technology companies. You don't have what China is doing right now, I don't think. So you can argue, I think, and that's safe too, you can argue that this was a bad deal, that this was bad for Chinese workers. You can say because it allowed this exploitation. I don't know if that's entirely true, because I think you look at the living conditions, living standards of Chinese workers. I think they've surpassed places in Western Europe in terms of like purchasing power parity, the PPP. Like I think they make more money now than workers in Portugal. So, and this, I mean, Portugal is one of the poorer areas in Western Europe, but still, this is an advancement. There were certain things they did away with during the 80s, including universal healthcare, which they had universal socialized healthcare. They've gone to a model now, which is a mixture of public and private, which is sort of universal coverage. That was one of the things that Xi Jinping advanced along with.
I didn't know that.
So you can purchase private insurance, but everybody has to be covered. So that if you don't have enough money, the state will cover it, kind of thing. So I mean, this is functionally pretty similar to Canada in a way. So they made this bargain, but can you say this bargain didn't help out workers? I think it did. I think it also increased inequality. There's no doubt that there is massive inequality. There's no doubt that there's billionaires in China. But the question is, what is a billionaire in China versus what is a billionaire in, say, a country like the United States or a country like Canada? In a country like the United States or a country like Canada, a billionaire is actually functionally somebody who probably has access to all this money. Many of the billionaires in China were created during the sort of financialization, the opening up of financialization, are basically sometimes just paper billionaires. They're people who went to different banks and borrowed all of this money in a disorganized fashion. And, once these banks call in these loans, or they say, oh, this, they're not actually billionaires anymore. Second, what happened during that revolution, whether you can say it's not socialism, I don't care, whatever. It's almost a moot point now. That's an argument that whatever. Functionally, though, the Communist Party of China has control of the state. The Communist Party of China eradicated the national bourgeoisie as a class that has any power over it, but it does incorporate leading business figures, including some billionaires, within its apparatus. Those people are functionally under the control of the Chinese Communist Party, which is why they keep on ending up dead. they keep on ending up executed. I don't know when the last time a billionaire was executed in. Oh, sorry, I guess Jeffrey Goldstein. But but I don't know the last time a billionaire was executed in a Western country for crimes, financial crimes or otherwise, or anything like that. So the system that
exists
exists now.
Do not advocate the death penalty on 1+1. Hashtag just saying.
Yeah, I know. I believe in re-education. So whatever it is, whatever you want to call it, and even the Chinese itself they say they're working towards a moderately prosperous socialist society. They say they're involved in socialist construction, which they think was going to take a lot of time. Although they've reduced, it used to be 2050, there would be a moderately prosperous socialist society. Now I think it's 2035 or something like that. But they say they're involved in socialist construction, not that they have achieved something like socialism, et cetera, et cetera. And you could read the books of the major theoretical figures, which are published by the Foreign Languages Press, and they say, like, functionally, we want to get rid of a capitalist system, of capitalist social relations. We want to build socialism and then build communism. I also don't think it's some trick they're pulling. I don't think it's some cynical thing, like. In the 90s, if that was the case, why not? Why not just be like, oh, actually, we're a social democracy. Look, we've got these market relations. People sometimes say it's like, well, if they did that, the Chinese people would rise up because they love socialism so much. Like, well, now you're just saying that they're a bunch of idiots who are easily tricked because they got a hammer and sickle, and they're like, well, if they got the hammer and sickle, then obviously it was like. So I don't think that's the case. So anyways, I think. Another interesting thing to talk about is you talk about taxation and stuff like that, is you look at participatory budgeting, which happens on a scale in China in certain cities, which is like there's a city in China which is relatively the same size as Toronto. Toronto's the largest city in Canada. They do participatory budgeting in the hundreds of millions of dollars, which means that citizens directly get to say what they want to spend the money in. In Toronto, a similar size city, we did participatory budgeting. I think it was like $80,000 or here and there and stuff. And what you could propose whatever you wanted, but basically the city staff limited it to like, more lighting in the park. Oh, here's a bench or something like that. Whereas like in China, as in Cuba, the participatory budgeting there involves like large scale infrastructure projects. Oh, you want this? It's not like we want a drinking fountain kind of stuff. So I think there's a lot to be written too. I mean, most of the people who write now about China stuff like it's because naturally in the Western world, our focus is this geopolitical competition. It's about the economic system and that. But there's not too many people who are writing, at least accessibly in English, about the political system and how it operates. And I think that's work that really needs to be done, because I think that'll go a long way to demystifying China, which like part of Sinophobia also is just advancing these old anti-Asian tropes, right? About they're inscrutable, they're wily, can't trust them. Any economist cover is going to be like, why are they kowtowing, saving face, Confucian value?
Yeah.
Engage with China as the second largest economic power, which will soon be the first, which is, I believe, run by principled Marxist-Leninists, but has any of the problems of any state, which is there's corruption, there's all these stuff. And yes, there is exploitation too. And that's an issue they have to deal with.
Yeah, no, I think, that's exactly why I wanted to ask you, because, I was just thinking to myself how little I actually know about China. What I do know about China is human rights abuse stories, here and there, but ask anyone what's the constitution in China or what's the constitution in Russia, and I guarantee you they'll probably look at you completely blank-faced because they simply don't know. Not their fault that they don't know, but they just don't know because we keep seeing China through the eyes of Marxists who don't who don't like how who don't like how the system was conducted for whatever reason, and that's why I wanted to ask how is even like taxation done like in China? Like, is it like a progressive tax system that we can compare it to the West? Because I know because people say like about like communism now, like communism doesn't work because you're paying somebody at McDonald's the same wages you're paying somebody at who works at a hospital or something like that.
No, and I don't think that's not really been a feature of socialist countries anyways, is that sort of like flat wage scale or anything like that. I mean, that's not really ever been a feature of socialist countries. I actually don't know that much about taxation. I understand they do have a progressive taxation system. I think it's actually relatively low in terms of personal taxes. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. There's other people who've written about it. We should find them and figure it out. But I am also a victim of not looking too much into it and focusing a little too much on the geopolitical aspects of it.
Well, no problem. And I think well, this leads to this perfect second question then, which is, what differs the Chinese system from, say, the Philippines, Indonesia, or Singapore? And the reason why I asked that question is because many social democrats will denounce China as allowing Western businesses to exploit its workers, has tolerated the growing gap between the rich and poor, and the state will work in tandem with big business to big multinational corporate Western businesses to suppress workers' rights and revolts. So what do you distinguish? How do you distinguish those criticisms of the Chinese states from, say, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Singapore?
So I think of those three, probably the strongest case you could make for similarities would be Singapore. Although Singapore is more of like a finance capital sort of hub, so I guess kind of like a Hong Kong. The system probably is the most similar. I mean, actually, Singapore, I think 90% of the housing in Singapore is public housing, is publicly provided, which is interesting. But Indonesia and the Philippines, I think, are the opposite. I mean, they're both sort of U.S. client states. Obviously, in Indonesia, they killed every person who was in the Communist Party, so there's no Communist Party in power there. And you can see that the level of exploitation, while they could have periods of massive economic growth, there's also inequality there, like there's inequality in China, but there's grueling, devastating poverty that continues to force people from those countries away. For example, in Canada is one of the main spots where Filipinos come here to work, basically to send remittances back. This is not so much the case in China, although there's been in the past, obviously, migration. So I think it's probably obvious if you visit Indonesia, Philippines, and any modern Chinese country that there's also not these, like, as the recent they've eradicated extreme poverty. This is not the case in Indonesia. It's not the case in Philippines. I don't think it will be the case until they have some sort of functional social and economic change in those societies. So I mean, in terms of like, is there exploitation of labor? Yeah, there is. I don't know. I guess that's we agree with. I think this is a feature of socialist production. There was exploitation of labor in the USSR. Yeah.
And any response you want to make towards towards the social democrats who say that, like, that China has allowed it went from this Stalinist Maoist dictatorship to now this corporatist dictatorship on the level of Indonesia and the Philippines. Like, do you want to push back against like some of those criticisms?
Yeah, because I don't think that corporations are in power in China. I think they're under the thumb. I think was it 3 years ago, the Communist Party declared, okay, you need to have a Communist Party cell that is working in your corporation that is present at all of your board meetings. Like, that is something that would not fly in Indonesia or the Philippines, where primarily Western corporations, large monopolies, dictate to the government what the government should do, what the conditions of labor should be. This is not the case in China. So even the notion that it's corporatist, I don't think that's true. Does it work with corporations? Yes. Does it have state-owned enterprises that functionally are corporations. Huawei is technically a workers-owned cooperative, which not much people talk about, but it functions like a corporation. But those corporations are under the control of the Chinese Communist Party, and I believe the Chinese people. I don't think that's the case in Indonesia and the Philippines. And I think it is. You just like poverty eradication is a big component like that that just does not exist in the Indonesia and Philippines.
Interesting. And yeah, and actually, yeah. Well,
and I would say, I mean, if this is Social Democrats bringing it up, like, well, I don't know. Social Democrats in their current iteration, anyways, don't believe in socialism. They believe in a market-based economy. I mean, ostensibly, you could say that the Chinese model in its caricature is more like what they would like.
Exactly. It's funny how the purists pick and choose sometimes, isn't it?
And I'll get to this too. Is like I don't look at the Chinese system as a model for every other society. I don't think you can just take it and even put it in Indonesia, you put it in the Philippines, it's going to work out, or do anything like that. I also think you do need a revolution that gives the ability to embark on a path of socialist construction. That I think the existence of China, for example, has been a boon to Cuba, to Bolivia, to these other countries who have a different model that they're approaching too as well. But, you know, does China do bad things? I think 100% China does bad things. I think China has basically a sort of funnily enough, a sort of Khrushchevite foreign policy, which is that, you know, we want to stay out of things. We believe in international sovereignty, et cetera, et cetera. If your government, and this is a little different, if your government is bad and is willing to, like, you know, sell us your port or something like that, we'll work with your government. If your government is good and wants to have like different terms set on, wants to get the most they can out of the Chinese government, they can. And they'll always, this is the big thing, is that China is a player in terms of development aid, in terms of infrastructure development, in a way that, you know, if you're running, you're even on the right, you're on the left, whatever, you're running some small country and you want to do some sort of form of economic development, you look at, there's the IMF and what the IMF does to countries, and there's China and what China does to countries. You're going to go with China. It's a preferential term. I think that also opens up a lot of space then for countries that might have a more classical state socialist model or something like that, or want to, you know, to have a country like China that is powerful, that is willing to work with them. I think that's a good thing. I think it opens up a lot of space for the future.
Interesting that you mentioned that. We're definitely, and I definitely want to return to that statement you made, and that's just a perfect segue then for this question, which is, can you talk about Chinese dissidents? Chinese dissidents like the late Liu Xiaobo, the artist, I always butcher his name, Weiwei.
Yeah.
And that being said, can you give some of your reflections then on the Tiananmen Square Massacre and how that event still negatively affects people's understanding towards China, their hostility towards China with this new Cold War, and yeah, so talk about those Chinese dissidents and help us demystify also Mr. Jimmy Lai of Hong Kong and Apple Daly.
Okay, all right, jumping that. Tiananmen Square, I think, I don't know, maybe it's controversial. I mean, there's a lot of people who, when you ask them about it, this is perhaps less common now, will, like, their memory is like, oh, someone got squished by a tank. Not watching the video, which is like a guy coming out with his shopping bag, getting in front of the tank, and then kind of hustling off like no one was killed by a tank. All to say, I don't agree with the dominant narrative that exists about. I think I would hew more towards the line. I think that there was two things going on at the time. There was a workers movement, mostly out of the square and stuff, and there was a student movement which was more Western oriented, more opposed to socialism, I think, and that there was violence unleashed against those people because in response to the murder of Chinese soldiers, that happened first. Is I think, and you can look back. I mean, just Google it. There's photos of burnt buses of like a burnt like Chinese soldier and stuff. This is what came before the suppression of the activists.
Interesting.
Too. So, but in terms of I don't know the large amounts of death, body counts and stuff like that, I don't think it's really valid. It's been a little while since I talked about it, I guess, but yeah. So I don't know. I would encourage people to like just look at it. How does this? Sorry, what was the second part of your question?
I think, how does the events of Tiananmen Square still, how does it still impact people's understanding of China? Because people's understanding of China is often seen through Tiananmen Square as a totalitarian regime, and of course you have these you have people on the left who sort of like say like we should not have détente with China because look at how they treat their workers, look at how they
so I mean in the 80s in South Korea in 1980 I think there was the Gwangju massacre where on the orders of the United States they just went in and just murdered thousands of people. That the South Korea, the Republic of Korea, was functionally a military dictatorship for decades. That the second to last leader in South Korea, I think, was the daughter of one of the dictators. Was hustled out, thankfully. That nobody, even people on the left, don't look down at South Korea as some sort of like form of capitalist dictatorship, which I think entirely it is, and it doesn't even have operational command of its own military. The United States does. It's a client state, and it's done hideous things. I mean, they murdered tens of thousands of homeless people too to clear out for the 1988 Olympics in Seoul. It's a horrific place, and I mean, I think you can look at the rates of suicide amongst elderly people because they have no state pension system there. There's this form of social murder being carried out on aging working class Koreans that just does not exist in China. That you can find out about. Actually, it's covered in the Guardian or New York Times occasionally and stuff like that. They don't make it as part of a propaganda war against Korea, but it's there. And if people were so attuned to what's happening in China, ostensibly they should be thinking the same thing about Korea. But the difference is these let's say the negative aspects of the Chinese social system are heightened and tied into a political project that the ruling class has, whereas criticisms or exposures of the social ills of the Korean system are just presented as this is kind of sad, but not there's no sort of like and thus Korea is evil. No, it's just like it's a social ill or something like that. So I don't know when people bring it. I mean, I guess is that whataboutism? Yeah, fine. I don't know. Yeah, okay. I'll do some whataboutism. What about Korea? There we go.
That's interesting. That's interesting. She brought that up, and we're definitely going to do a whole episode on Korea in the future. But then going back to China. And the fact that there are these double, triple standards, because I'll just say expanding on what you just mentioned, people talk about radical Islam and how we need to eradicate radical Islam, and then they advocate they advocate sanctions on Iran. And they're fine, but and they're fine with the Americans drone bombing Pakistan. And having a war with the Taliban, and yet Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who export ISIS into Syria and so forth, nobody's advocating for a war with with the Saudis and the Qataris. And I think it's kind of that, and that's kind of that same thing where people talk about Chinese human rights abuses, and I'm not saying that there aren't Chinese human rights abuses. I've told you before that I'm not a fan of of the current Chinese system. But yeah, what about? Okay, yes, I'm engaging in whataboutism right now. But yeah, but it is also about where are all of these people's criticisms of corporatism and inequality in China and cheap labor in China, when it does come to South Korea, which throughout the Cold War was a right-wing junta.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think some people, there are people on the left who obviously make these criticisms of our relationship to Saudi Arabia. I don't think it's well. I mean, in my country at least, anyways, there's people on the left who I would disagree with on China who are good on opposing, say, arms sales to Saudi Arabia, opposing the war on Yemen. I think there's stuff that exists. So I don't think it's entirely that everyone on the left is ignores that sort of stuff. But I don't know. It seems that there's a tendency for people to want to sort of prove, let's say on the softer left, to prove that like, oh, I can equally do these things. I've got it. Like, why? Why do you feel it necessary when the ruling class is obviously, everyone knows the ruling class is orchestrating an anti-China campaign for its own interests? Why? It must be exhausting to be like, I've got to sign on to everything to prove that I'm a good leftist. I've got to support the bombing of Gaddafi. He's kind of weird. He seems mean. Yeah, I could see it. He's gonna, that's totally, I mean, giving into this sort of like ruling class parody of whatever Gaddafi is. I think there's criticisms of Gaddafi which are really good. Ruth First from the South African Communist Party wrote an amazing book on him, et cetera, et cetera. But many people on the left went along with the bombing of Libya. Why? Did they care about Libya so much? If they cared about Libya, they haven't said it after the bombing. They don't talk about it now. So just this idea that you've got to go along, whatever the ruling class is talking about, you've got to like get on board with it and provide like a left angle to it. It must be exhausting, especially considering you get played all the time and then not talk about it. I mean, unfortunately, China is one of those things. It's too big. You're not going to destroy China. If there is, then we're all dead. Since World War III, the planet's gone anyways. But yeah, I don't know. There's always these people on the left who I just feel, yeah, it just seems I don't know. I don't like the feeling of being manipulated. And it just seems to me, if you had any self-respect, you would kind of consider that fact. And you don't have to say anything, maybe. What's the big deal? Also, we're Canada. It's a country of 30 million people. Yes, we're considered a Western country. We're very rich, but I don't know. Like, why do you have to have an opinion on China? What's like? What? I think why do I have an opinion on China is because it's run by a communist party. Also because my ruling class is just determined to like make it an issue, to make a war against them, and I think it's very dangerous, and so that's why I would prefer to like not think too much about China and think about other things, but it's being forced upon.
And I just have to mention Syria, Syria as well with Libya. It's amazing to see how people still are determined to support non-existent moderate rebels because Amnesty International says that there are moderate rebels, or they see one stupid thing on Netflix.
Yeah.
And so. And then going back to China, then, can you talk about the late dissident Liu Xiaobo and the artist Weiwei and Jimmy La demystify those three dissidents for us?
I'm not familiar with the first one. Weiwei, I know just as the guy who like does the planking thing or whatever, like did that. Like, speaking of Syria, this is an interesting story. So, there's that famous photo of the child who drowned, like a refugee. It is Alan Kurdi, I think his name was. Anyways, it turned out that his aunt is Syrian. She lives in Canada. So when that came out, there was a lot of interviews, a great outpouring of sympathy for her, et cetera, et cetera. And then it turned out that in some of her interviews, she would say, and we know who is responsible for the destruction of Syria. It's the United States government. So very quickly, no one wanted to talk to her anymore because she was saying, like, this is what happened to my nephew. I know why it's happening. But so Weiwei, his big thing was to like do a variation on that picture or something. I think one of is like him in a lying on the. I don't know. Whatever. And this is another thing too. Dissident is such a term. Like, am I a dissident in Canada? No one say Jay Watt's communist dissident. A dissident is somebody who's weaponized by primarily Western imperialism in China. I mean, the term, you only hear it in terms of Cuba, China, the Soviet Union, and the hideous, awful magazine in the United States. But yeah, I don't know. So when I think of dissidents, when I hear that, I mean, to me, that just says asset. Like, it just says somebody who's connected to the sort of NGO industrial complex. That is probably, even if they're, I mean, Navalny, I guess he gets to be called a dissident too, as well, right? Like, I never hear it. I never hear it used for anybody on the left. It's always these weirdo right-wing people. Jimmy Lai, I mean, yeah, that's another thing too about this sort of like left-wing preoccupation.
Yeah, Jimmy Lai and Jimmy Lai, allow me to interject. Jimmy Lai is a media mogul of, I think, Apple Daly. Some people describe him as the Rupert Murdoch. Well, I mean, his critics describe him as the Rupert Murdoch of Hong Kong. And the reason why I ask him is because Hong Kong's in the news. Jimmy Lai got a very favorable treatment on Vice magazine, and he came across as a very sensible, I guess liberal, because he's certainly not left wing, but certainly liberal. So talk about like Jimmy Lai and like demystify him for a Western left audience.
He's an ultra right wing crook that made his fortune in some pretty shady ways, and he has a lot. He stands well. The initial protests were started because of the worry about extradition. Basically, a guy killed his pregnant girlfriend, put her in a fucking suitcase, and then ran off, and the Chinese government wanted to extradite him. The reason why this is a big issue and the reason why it was pushed as a big issue is because billionaires in Hong Kong, who have an inordinate amount of power over that area, see what happens to some billionaires on the mainland and are scared as shit. If there is any possibility that they're going to be investigated for corruption and then sent to the mainland, it's over, right? So somebody like Jimmy Lai, I mean, he can't come out and say that. He can't come and say, the thing I'm worried about most is they might look into me and arrest me. Like, and then what's happening to me and where's my money gone? No, he's got to come out with this fucking like racist piece of trash, Apple Daly. And there's a number of people who've like translated articles you can see calling mainlanders cockroaches. They're invading. They're awful. Mandarin is a disgusting language, et cetera, et cetera. So he's got to sort of build this movement with existing people who do. And this is what I say about the Hong Kong movement, is that people who are protesting, who are upset, are, I'd say it's a class of people who are probably middle class kids, probably went through like a finance program, are seeing that Hong Kong's status as what it used to exist before, which was a pathway for international capital to work with the mainland, doesn't make any sense right now. If Hong Kong disappeared off the face of the planet, just went away, China can easily work with international capital in the mainland. Also, do you need a bunch of Cantonese speaking people to be you're going to build a factory on mainland China? Do you need somebody who speaks Cantonese, who can't speak Mandarin, to like be your go-between? No, you don't. So these people functionally are living, well, and they're in reduced circumstances. There's a housing crisis in Hong Kong, which is exacerbated because the sort of traditional business elite there they're speculating on vast amounts of property that the Chinese, more pro-Beijing wing, wants to like open up for development to create housing. That it's the finance, insurance, and real estate billionaires who do functionally control Hong Kong in an economic sense, who don't want to alleviate the problems of the people below them. So you have what is a middle class revolt, which is oriented around degrading economic circumstances. So Jimmy Lai, he's not suffering from that. I don't think he's not living in like a shoebox apartment or anything like that. But he can't come out and say that what I'm most worried about is that if the Chinese government or even the Hong Kong government looks into like my business dealings and sees what a shady fuck I am, then it's over for me. He can't say that. So he's got to say, look at these mainlanders coming and stealing from you. This is the reason. Yeah, that's just typical demagoguery. And it's unfortunate to see people on the left like adopt it and say that this is somehow some sort of like progressive movement, when at every possible moment they've shown they're not progressive. They're waving American flags, holding pictures of the Queen, like Donald Trump as Rambo, burning fucking people alive, attacking school children. Like, it's a fascist movement. But there's many fascist movements that just because they're movements of people doesn't make them progressive. And just because they're based in some real economic malaise or uncertainty also doesn't mean that what they want is a progressive thing. So there's many criticisms to be made of Hong Kong. And I think in reality, the process of decolonization that the People's Republic of China would want to instigate would actually benefit the people who live in Hong Kong. But I mean, there's many years of sort of British education and internalized racism to overcome there, and so it's decolonization is a messy process, as any country knows.
So is it safe to say that the people of Hong Kong, they want Hong Kong to remain a Singapore in China, a kind of a corporatist China, and that maybe some do want like liberal democracy. Maybe some even would like a more robust social democracy. But at the end of the day, the people who are leading the protests in Hong Kong, no, I mean these are rival oligarchs who don't want the sort of Chinese. The Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics, in which China would actually put a lid on some of these excessive billionaires and white collar crooks and whatnot.
So I don't know too much about the polling there, but I do know in terms of separatism is not a dominant sentiment within the population of Hong Kong. And also that there's a substantial working class that did not engage in these protests. That is functionally younger student, middle class kind of people, of which there are quite a few. Like, it's not to say it's not a mass movement, but there's not an even split. I think they represent a minority position. I think also the tactic why do they adopt these ultra-violent tactics? It's because they are a minority position. If you're in that position, one of the classical things that you see adopted by Western-supported dissident movements, protest movements, and stuff like that, is to up your tactics to a level of violence, to, I would say, in many cases, sort of terrorism, in order to provoke a heavy-handed response from the state. I mean, this was this is like, if we look at the sort of peak of the protests, when things were going really crazy, they were constantly saying, there's another Tiananmen Square coming, there's another Tiananmen Square coming, blah, 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 blah. You look at the restraint. First of all, no, the PLA was not sent in to anywhere like that. This is happening at the same time as protests in the United States, where there are people being murdered on the street. I think in China, there was one death on a protesters. It was a guy who fell off a building. Maybe he was pushed, maybe committed suicide. One death. And you look at the level of violence they were engaged in versus anything you could say that anti-racist protesters were engaged in the States. It's mind-boggling. They were like, there's like Molotov cocktails, attacking people, killing people with bricks. Like, the reason why they were so violent is because they are not supported by the masses of people, because there's not a demand for separatism. There's a demand for a continuing relationship and an autonomy, which is, I think, fine. I think it's entirely their right. Separatism is also their right, but it's not a dominant demand of the populace of Hong Kong. And this is why they're engaged in this sort of activity, is because they want to provoke that response, ostensibly from mainland China, to say, see what's happened. And I think by any standards, what you saw there was not mass repression by the state, but an extremely, a sophisticated response, which is like, okay, we're going to step back and you're going to see what these people are about. And you saw very quickly then the people got sort of fed up with the ongoing violence and destruction of their city.
Yeah, and before I get to the next question, you mentioned that you weren't too familiar with Liu Xiaobo. Liu Xiaobo was this Chinese dissident. I think he got the Nobel. Yeah, no, He did get the Nobel Peace Prize, and I won't talk too much about him. I don't know much about the circumstances of his death. I guess that's probably one of those half truths where it wasn't pretty cool of like how the Chinese dealt with his political activism. But I will say this: Liu Xiaobo supported the Iraq War. Liu Xiaobo said that Liu Xiaobo actually said that he would that he was for the Americans and their allies destroying Vietnam. He actually was on record saying that, and then I think also supported the Korean War. And he I mean, his criticism towards China wasn't so much China's human rights abuses and suppression of political thoughts, although he did sort of weaponize that, but it was more like he basically wanted China to basically be like what the U.S. was in terms of like Reaganomics, and Britain was Thatcherism. So again, people who depict this guy as this left icon fighting against the Chinese state. Anyways.
So I guess then dissident is just shorthand for like right-wing freak. Like,
exactly. And okay, so I'll skip this question because you sort of already answered this one about like about the free market. Actually no. Briefly explain how China has used its economy, and people can make whatever criticism they want about it. But can you talk about how China's used its economy with some of the with some of the Western investments that was used to help alleviate extreme poverty? Because you mentioned that that China from the 80s onwards has been using its kind of mixed economy to get people out of extreme poverty. Because you were mentioning that like Chinese workers actually have much more bargaining power in China nowadays compared to Western Europe and Canada, US.
Yeah, I mean there's lots of labor actions and sort of things like that, kidnapping bosses and stuff that goes on, and that union secure like things. There's tons of activity. Like there's still that happens within China. Not everything is crushed under the foot of the state or anything like that. But in terms of it's about technology transfer. That technology transfer of having Western capital build factories, trains engineers, means that there's people with certain professional skills, which means that then China is able to develop its own enterprise. Often state-owned enterprises are connected to the state that rapidly are able to, it wasn't too long ago, like really not that long, let's say 10 years, that made in China was ostensibly a joke because it was supposed to be of poor quality, et cetera, et cetera. Why was that a joke? Why was that something that maybe had a kernel of truth? The kernel of truth is because it was Western capital developing those products there. They wanted to use the cheapest labor, the cheapest materials in their production. But now we see when, like I've got a Huawei here, when a company like Huawei starts developing in conjunction with the Chinese state a sort of domestic product, a domestic corporation doing their own production, the level of production that they have is like, no one jokes about Huawei being an inferior made in China product. Those inferior products were made by Western capital because that's what they wanted to do to achieve super profits. So you have a situation now where you have an educated workforce. You did have a process of people moving out of rural areas to go and work. There's also now a process, part of the eradication of poverty is actually to look at how do we develop the countryside in a sustainable manner. And it even goes to stuff like keeping peasant agriculture, not going to a big agribusiness model, but knowing that small farmers are a way to reduce poverty is by supporting them. One of the biggest apps in China, I forget the name of it, which I have on this phone, but I can't use it because I'm not in China, is sort of like an Alibaba thing, which eliminates the middleman of like small producers. You can basically order food from small producers all across China of like whatever kind of things he wants. A very like agriculturally rich country. So that sort of model of development is even different than the agribusiness model push that's in Brazil with monocrops and stuff like that, large monopolies. Like that China actually sees poverty reduction as not just being you get to work in a factory and you'll make some money, which okay, that happened under capitalist development in industrialization. Working class people did get more wages, et cetera, et cetera. But also sees part of that is like, okay, we've had a lot of people move in to get these jobs at these factories, but we need to develop jobs above it, professional jobs. There needs to be technically advanced stuff. And we also need to keep smaller agriculture as a basis of feeding our people and not move to this monocrop agribusiness model. So the dynamics there in terms of like they understand the contradictions of development, which is we used labor labor was exploited by Western capital. The contradiction there that benefits is that by doing so, they gain technological knowledge, know-how, and the transfer of technologies so they could develop their own state-owned enterprises that often outperform anything that is put out by even Japanese companies or other high technology companies. They decided to try to eradicate extreme poverty. That meant putting people in those jobs from rural areas, but also recognize that still you need rural farmers to be able to feed your population. So what they're doing now is trying to engage more with like smaller agriculture, making sure that it isn't bought up by like agribusiness companies and run on that model. So there's all these interesting dynamics, which I think they don't indicate the chaos of capitalism and private production, but they indicate an awareness of what happens when you take certain development models and then what you can use out of that to be a countervailing tendency against the negative aspects of that development. And what do we see? I mean, if we had this, just to think that we would be having this conversation in 1970 would blow people's mind. The idea that China would be like the second largest economic power and still have the Communist Party running things would just be like baffling to most people, I think.
Sounds to me as if China is actually investing in social mobility, something which I thought capitalism was supposed to do, right?
Yeah. So if you want to call it a managed capitalism or something like that, I'm fine with that. I don't really like whatever. I'm done. I guess my days having those arguments is done. But I think they are involved in a socialist construction, and they're involved in dealing with certain problems. Whether those solutions would be, for example, in Canada, there isn't peasantry, and so we don't have those issues that China had to deal with. But there's certain issues that China deals with that we can learn from as socialists, as communists. We should be looking at all of these experiences, Cuba, the Eastern Bloc countries that were socialist, the Soviet Union, to see, because I think in many cases this is not a case of like it's a cynical project or something. I think there's honest people trying to figure out a project to create a new economic system that fulfills people's needs. I think they honestly are. I think at the same time there's corruption. There's people who are not good actors as in any system, but I think that fundamentally, that what is happening in China is motivated by a desire to create a new social system.
We already talked about this is one of my last questions. Talk about can you talk about freedom of the press in China before we talk about this ongoing issue with the with the Uighurs and stuff like that. Can you talk about freedom of the press in China and the criticisms people have towards China, that it's a one-party state, that most of the media is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, and why can't China just have a robust free press like in the U.S., in Britain, or yours truly, Japan and South Korea?
Yeah. I think it probably does. I mean, definitely social media, Weibo and stuff like that is, there's controls, there's censorship to a certain extent. That censorship is coming out of a different thing, though, and it's something that actually a comrade of mine, Daniel Joseph, has written about this. In the 70s in Canada, because we live next to the United States, one of the proposals by the Science Council that was appointed by the Trudeau government at the time was that because of networking infrastructure, et cetera, Canada, that was going to be a big thing in the future, that Canada should start invest on owning its own infrastructure, developing it, creating something of a firewall between us and the United States. So the sort of online censorship that happens in China is actually part of a project of development, of creating their own. They don't want Google, they don't want Apple, they don't want these larger companies which are, we know, tied to the military industrial complex, of the Five Eyes, to the security system, stuff like that. They don't want that operating because they know how important it is to have technological sovereignty. Part of that technological sovereignty is, I think, the censorship that exists is not so much a censorship of ideas of thought, because you can go, if you speak Mandarin, you can go on Weiwei, you can go on WeChat, you can see the level of discussion is varied and different and like not shut down. That there's lots of criticism of party, of the existing state of China. It's pretty damn robust. Certainly the stuff I've seen, and I don't speak Mandarin, so this is my fault. So I don't know too much about local press or anything like that, so I won't talk about that. But I'll say that at least the social media sort of censorship is related to their demands to create their own technological companies and stuff that is running, sort of like helping create the social system that they're in right now. So yeah, there's censorship. I don't know. We run candidates in every election. We have ostensibly a multi-party system. I don't think we don't get invited to the leaders' debates on television. We don't get guaranteed coverage. I think we get 2 minutes of like free airtime. Maybe we can show a little ad at 4 o'clock in the morning on state media. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, and all right, and then that's okay. Then let's my three last questions then is we already talked about the pivot to Asia. You addressed Hong Kong, but let's talk about the Uyghurs what are the half-truths, if there are any half-truths, being used to propagate people to support this dangerous new Cold War with China? And can you talk about some of the very flimsy evidence of a supposed genocide that's happening in the Jihana province and that weaponization of Chinese state Islamophobia, which is used to, support, an Islamic separatist movement in China, and demystify us, this Uyghur movement that's the West is supporting in China.
I think any engagement with that question has to start with, okay, let's, instead of just saying the Han Chinese are bigots and they hate Muslims and they want to murder them all, let's take it on good faith that, okay, there is a terrorist movement which also does not have majority support. There's a terrorist separatist movement which is foreign funded, does not have majority support of people in that region, which has used acts of violence in the past to terrorize the population, including fellow Muslims so I think right there, the evidence in Western media available says, yes, this is what happened. That many of the people engaged in terrorist activities were in Syria, were brought there by Turkey, were funded. That Turkey is also playing a role in funding the separatist terrorist movement there. That this exists. I think if you say it doesn't exist, I don't think we can have a conversation, and then I just don't like, it's just, I think this is a very basic thing you have to say exists. So acknowledging that, you can say what is that this is that acts of terrorism have happened in the past, do continue to happen in order to provoke a response from the state. The response that they've provoked is this response, is what I would call a de-radicalization program with security state elements. Let's say you don't like it. I know it exists. I know there's negative aspects to it. What would you propose they do instead? I'd rather hear from people who are critics of this. If you agree this is all happening, if you agree there's active violence, there are foreign funded terrorists who've recently being engaged in extreme combat, who have illiberal views, who are basically mujahideen types, connected to Jabhat al-Nusra, connected to that, connected to Turkey, to Erdogan, who is no Democrat, no friend of anybody. If you agree with all of that, what should they do differently? I think in many ways the path that they're following, the de-radicalization thing, which is like it's part of it exists in tandem with the anti-poverty reduction stuff, which is we want people to have more economic abilities. So vocational training, that's what these re-education centers are. They're both vocational training for the majority populace, which includes a language component, which is that okay, there are not a whole bunch of factories here, but you might be able to move further south, you might be able to get a job there, but you're going to have to speak Mandarin. Okay, so yet still their own language is available there. A comrade of ours went 2 years ago on his own because he wanted to see what was happening. He produced actually, there's a piece out in the Asian Times, a local newspaper here, which I'll send to you, which at that time, the genocide sort of thing wasn't being to it. It was more like, they can't speak their own language. So he took pictures. Here's signs written in their language. Men can't have beards. Here's pictures of men with beards. Oh, there's no mosques. Here's all the mosques. Took all these pictures, basically disassembled this sort of thing. Anyways, but he said,
and you can, and it's all out in the open. So, like, if I was to visit there, not part of any peace delegation, not part of any détente group, not part of the Communist Party of whoever, I can just go to this place, and you'll see a very robust, Islamic culture in this part of China, which apparently the Chinese are suppressing.
Yeah, and you can go there as a tourist. It's totally fine, and people have done it. And even a couple of years ago, maybe 2 years ago, or maybe a year ago, the Chinese government was like to the European Union, which was like criticizing, was like, come visit, like, okay, come see it then if you're saying this stuff. And the European Union's response was, oh, we can't right now. Like, it takes a lot of time to prepare for a trip like that. Maybe we'll do it later. The invitation is still open. They haven't come. And I won't go into all like where the source of this information is coming from, because I think the Gray Zone does a really good job about it. Who Adrian Zan is, who like the World Uyghur Congress based in fucking DC, Washington, DC, which has, somebody who used to work in Guantanamo Bay as one of their spokespeople. Anyway, that stuff is out there now. People are kind of seeing how ridiculous it is. Let's go back to what are the negative features. And Omar in his article said the negative features are the negative features of any state that is dealing with terrorism. And I don't believe in this idea, which some people have, which is like, look, they're using this war on terror language, ergo it's the same as the United States and their war on terror. No, I think that's a rhetorical device that they're using to point out to the states to say, you said there was terrorism and this is how you responded. We can show there's active terrorism, so why aren't we allowed to do these? Why aren't we allowed to have an anti-terror campaign? I think fundamentally what differs from the war on terror, which basically changed the nature of American engagement in many areas, led to the deaths of millions, the destruction of many countries, is that China's not doing that. China's not going to Turkey and deciding to overthrow Erdogan because he supports, this movement, even though by the rules of the United States, that would be apparently a fine for a preemptive strike.
Or even China intervening in Syria.
Yeah, China is engaged with. They have a state security apparatus there. Omar is very clear. He's like, you go into public buildings. There's metal detectors. There's these things because they are dealing with terrorism. But part of that is not just a suppressive state surveillance society, which 100% exists. It is these de-radicalization programs, which involve vocational training and then also this cultural training for people who have been engaged in these groups, rather than locking them up in fucking Guantanamo Bay and torturing them and taking pictures of them and spreading it around of them being tortured and treating them hideously. They are following this process, which I think is probably very similar in many respects to de-radicalization programs that Western European nations have, which I think is probably another thing that I think the EU doesn't want to go, because the EU wants to be able to be like, we're criticizing China, but if we went there, we would have to say, at its most negative aspects, it's pretty similar to things we do. And they don't want to get in a big fight with the US if they said something like that. So yeah, I think the core thing, if you're talking to somebody about what's happening there, is to say, look, you have to admit that this is a situation China is dealing with, and instead of telling me why this is bad that they're doing this, tell me what is an alternative strategy they could use. That if they're actually dealing with foreign-funded terrorists who are not supported by the majority of population, who are using violence in order to provoke a response from the state, what should the state do differently then? What should China do differently? I've tried to ask this question to people who say that, and they don't have an answer, because I don't think that people are actually thinking this through. They're responding emotionally, and probably for good reasons, to what they see from corporate press and to these accusations and stuff. But I think it demands a little more scrutiny, and it demands a lot of skepticism, and I don't see that. And I think people, unfortunately, even after 20 years, 9/11 or whatever, are just falling for this stuff again and again and again, and it's distressing. And this isn't Libya. This is China. This is a nuclear power. Well, I guess Libya was a nuclear power until Gaddafi gave it away. So it's the stakes are incredibly high. So if I get this wrong, am I a genocide denier? Okay, maybe there's a genocide, and I'm getting it totally wrong. The one thing that I'm trying to do by talking about this and stuff like that is to get my state not to amp up the pressure, because if you're saying there's a genocide, the next step is like, we need military action to stop that genocide. Do you think China's going to go along with that? No, you're talking about provoking a war, and a world war between nuclear powers. So my being wrong maybe I'm denying a genocide, but the worst thing that's going to happen if I'm wrong is unfortunately not as bad as the worst thing that happens, which I'm right, which is a nuclear war, which is World War III.
And if anyone's interested, like, I would like to have that debate, but nobody seems to want to actually have that, debate. But quick follow up: the World Uyghur Congress, who actually funds that?
The National Endowment for Democracy, so the U.S. government, okay. Basically the CIA. Yeah,
that's all right. That's all I need to know, and those are the same bunch of Western deep state douchebags that are supporting the Hong Kong protests. And then, so second to last question. Wow, we're getting there, Jake. So my second to last question, is my second to last question is, okay, Tibet. Now is okay. So let's talk about Tibet and and Buddhism. And is China's is China's treatment of Tibet, the Tibetan Buddhist population, comparable to Canada's treatment of indigenous people, the U.S.'s treatment of Native Americans and similar colonial states? And when one talks about cultural genocide, imperialism, and colonization, when one talks about cultural imperialism and colonization, can you actually compare China to China's treatment to the Tibetans to how to the Five Eyes Alliance? And why can't China just tolerate Tibetans to practice their own culture while maintaining a strict separation of church and states?
Okay, the thing I think, and this doesn't get mentioned too much on the left, is that there was a revolution. There was a revolution against an existing feudal system in China and outside of Tibet, and there was Tibetans who participated in the Communist Party in that revolution in Tibet. That it didn't initially overthrow the Tibetan Buddhist structure there, as represented by the Dalai Lama. In fact, I think the Dalai Lama were in negotiations with the PRC government in order to secure some sort of autonomous structure there, which it actually is technically an autonomous region within Tibet or within China. So I don't think it's a case of, as in sort of colonial societies, of somebody coming from abroad, wiping out the population, et cetera, is that Tibetans actively were engaged in that revolution and wanted the overthrow of the feudal system, which included slavery, that it was a popular revolution, that that doesn't mean that there's not tensions between existing practices, like religious practices, and what the Chinese state wanted to do. And we know that, I mean, this happened during the Russian Revolution too. There was a period of sort of like anti-religious hysteria, which did not play out well. This happened during the Spanish Civil War. Anarchists went around strangling priests and doing sort of nasty things. And there's a lot of like poor Spanish people who probably like those priests, and there are probably a lot of poor Spanish people who didn't like them. So I don't think it's comparable. I think that erases the fact that Tibetan people fought for their own liberation too. That it wasn't just, you know, the Han Chinese marching into Tibet.
Okay,
and that they still practice their religion there. Does anybody say they don't? I don't get this.
No. Honestly, I mean, like I've not kept up to date with it, but yeah, many people. I mean, the Free Tibet movement, the sort of like Free Tibet movement, you know, they say that that Buddhism is is strictly prohibited there because China is a fundamentalist, anti-religious society. Hence why the Dalai Lama and his followers are outside of Tibet and so forth. And yeah. And I mean, the last I checked, there was a Tibetan like Buddhist that like set himself on fire as a way to protest against religious persecution that exists in China.
So I think even you look at the polling and stuff like that, like it's separatism for Tibet is not a majority movement there as well. And I think it's definitely, I mean, obviously there's a diaspora. I live in Parkdale in Toronto. It's one of the largest areas of a Tibetan population outside of Nepal. China, not Nepal and India, but the largest Western like kind of population. And there's definitely support for separatism within this community here. There's also Tibetans who aren't for it as well, but who have left with their families, a couple decades ago, or even were in Nepal and then came here. So I do believe in the right for nations, and the Tibetans are a nation, to have national sovereignty. But when it comes to separatism, it's not a majority issue, no matter how Tibetans might feel outside of China. But I think that's related to the certain loss of like class interests. And I don't think, I mean, I live in Canada. There's diaspora. There's large, because we use immigration in a certain way, there's large amounts of people who are diaspora communities, have their own politics, whose politics sometimes align with me. There's progressive Latin American communities, and sometimes they don't. And I don't think just because you happen to be outside of your country that means that whatever you say is something that I should support. I support if the majority of and who gives a shit what I think anyways, but if the majority of Tibetans want separatism, they should move towards it, but they don't.
So why is the Dalai Lama then not in China right now?
Because he took money from the CIA and started a war of terror against the Chinese government. That's why. And yeah, I mean, noted Tibetan.
Well, then talk about that, because many people probably don't know that. Many people think that he was just kicked out of the country because the Chinese were so intolerable towards Buddhism and so forth. And some people would say, yes, he accepted money from the CIA because, hey, those were the only people that were willing to help him against, incoming Chinese imperialism.
I don't know. I don't find that compelling. I mean, people always say that all the time. Oh, they'd be really. No, he was a slave owner. Doesn't matter if he the Dalai Lamas or Dalai's Lama. I don't know if it's like attorneys general or whatever. They were slave owners. Who cares about their war of liberation if it's to maintain a feudalistic slave owning society? No, doesn't enthuse me so much. And so if he took again, I guess we should call him a dissident, because he is friends with George Bush, also pretty okay with the Iraq War, right-wing politics. I don't know. I was around for the 90s and the Beastie Boys.
Yeah.
Yada yada. 7 years in Tibet based on a fucking Nazi. I I don't know. It never animated me that much. And I mean, I think the reason why it was made such a big deal was because of Western funding in the 90s that they saw that the Soviet Union had fallen. This was in the aftermath of Tiananmen Square, that it was a way to pressure China to go along more with what the United States and imperialism wanted. That it's not even. I mean, there's a long-standing support of the U.S. government and Dalai Lama, and if you don't know that, I think it's not. That's something that has never been hid at all. Like it's a pretty open relationship.
And you simply don't buy into well, hey, the Chinese were violating Tibetan sovereignty, and therefore, hey, these the only friends the Dalai Lama could find was the West, which never fully went to a full scale war over Tibet, and I think the Dalai Lama kind of got burned because it was like, okay, we'll play a little bit of footsie of this Cold War thing, but we're not going to fully push back against it because of the Sino-Soviet splits, and of course later, the U.S. going fully détente with China, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, there was a period after the revolution, which Tibetans participated in, which was a period of negotiation with the Dalai Lama's camp or whatever, and the People's Republic of China, and what was fundamentally considered like a line that the Dalai Lama and others did not want to cross was like was the liberation of serfs, basically, of the end of feudalism, to a progressive change in social relations and a diminishment of their old archaic control over the populace. And that many Tibetans did not agree with the Dalai Lama's pursuit of that, which is why they needed money from the CIA. If it was such an overwhelming supported thing, you don't need money from the CIA. If the populace is 90% on your back, or for you, you win. You don't need money from the CIA to do it.
Interesting. And for more on that, people should check out Michael Parenti, who's done some very interesting investigations into the skeletons of the Dalai Lama and Tibet's former feudal society's closets. And this leads to second to last question then. Second to last question. Taiwan. Now, this is probably the one issue where I might find myself in disagreement with you and other comrades of mine on the Communist Party of Canada, which is the issue of Taiwan. Now, can I be a true anti-imperialist, want détente with China, but say that I support Taiwan to remain an independent country, not part of China, and challenge me on that if you will, Laura.
It's a state created by the losing side of a war in the revolution, basically. So I don't know. I don't know. I don't feel too strongly about it. I guess I think that's for Taiwan and China to decide. I think even if there was some sort of I think the sort of hyper Taiwanese, which also was a military dictatorship for quite a long time, the sort of hyper Taiwanese.
Yes, it was. And Chiang Kai-shek was a drug lord. I mean, the first triads were actually from Taiwan, and there was a very brutal. People talk about about Chinese political persecution of other people. Taiwan, there's lots of that going on towards anyone to the left of Bernie Sanders and to anyone that was a communist and was interested in having détente with China and possibly reunifying with China. So that's quite terror.
I think reunification is a process. Look, if there was no American imperialism, it'd probably be a more distinct possibility than it is now. That I think the sort of it's just another pressure point that the U.S. is using. That I think if the U.S. was not there to fund and push this sort of stuff and to build up the Taiwanese military, that reunification under a peaceful, negotiated process would be a possibility. I think maybe if I don't know, it's hard to say. But let's say the U.S. peacefully declines as an empire, then these sort of things become more possible. But unfortunately, I don't see that as happening. I don't think the U.S. does anything peacefully. So, and certainly not die peacefully.
Do you think it's possible, though, to be against the pivot to Asia and still, advocate to Taiwan be an independent country, or is it, or should I put those feelings aside? Should we all put those feelings aside and just say, you know what? Let Taiwan just have a referendum whether they want to be an independent country, whether they want to be an independent country or be remarried to China. Should that just be international law going forwards?
Well, I think the international law mostly does not recognize Taiwan. Like I mean, that was part of some geopolitical stuff during the Cold War, but that's still the case. Personally, like, I don't know, yeah, it's an issue for them to work out. I think that as in the instance of Hong Kong, which is actually kind of similar. I mean, Hong Kong also was there was indigenous nations there who were pushed out when when the British took it over, when the revolution happened too. A lot of people from the mainland came there, colonized that that place, just like has happened in Taiwan. So I don't know. I think it's something that, in the absence of imperial fuckery, can be negotiated pretty peacefully. I think that China has shown that it's fine with certain like political autonomy for certain regions, stuff like that. Like, I think they're pretty nimble. I think in some ways better than the Soviet Union at it. And
really, China, you find much more tolerance of provinces having power compared to the Soviet Union, the USSR, the Eastern Bloc.
Support for languages, support for certain, autonomous control for certain nations. I mean, even look at the one-child policy, for example. This is the thing. If you're calling China a Han supremacist nation, that one-child policy was directed at the Han Chinese. Like, during Nazi Germany, they didn't say, okay, Aryans, you can only have one child. Let all the other nations here have multiple children. So that's a kind of it's a kind of weird thing. Like, you can agree or disagree with the one-child policy, but it doesn't make sense if you're trying to accuse them of being a Han supremacist nation, that they would limit the reproductive growth of Han Chinese over other nationalities. So,
but tolerate the Uyghurs to have more than one child.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and people say things like, well, there's been a drop in the birth rate in the region, but that just maps with economic development. That's just what happens. I mean, Canada has a low birth rate now compared to what it did in the past, and that's just what happens as areas industrialize and stuff like that. Is like, oftentimes during poverty, people have more children in order because they need to be taken care of when they're older, and there's a sort of an economic circumstance there. As you are able to, get something more closely resembling a working class job or existence and less sustenance, the necessity of having children to secure your future is reduced. And obviously, women being more educated or less and working are less likely to have children. This is just what happens. It's like,
interesting, okay, yeah. So, and then going forward, then you mentioned this is my last question, and the big ends, now, is China an imperialist nation? Is China an imperialist capitalist nation that's competing with the Five Eyes Alliance? And why do you feel that China is not an imperialist capitalist nation when it comes to Chinese businesses expanding in Africa? And of course, and this goes back to this whole theme of this conversation, which is the Western left's hostility towards China, and thinking that I need to criticize Chinese Chinese mining, Chinese 5G, and I'm against Western plunderers of the planet, but I'm not for the Chinese one. And yeah,
so I think China is hegemonic, and I think it does some nasty things. I don't think it's necessarily imperialist, even if it does export capital. I think fundamentally the world financial system is still controlled by Western governments. The SWIFT system of moving massive amounts of money is controlled by the United States. Banking in many areas, finance capital and stuff by Anglo-American companies and Western Europe. So China still has to work within that system. I think when it does, well, mining is a good example, actually. So in Africa, Canadian mining interests are totally dominant. Like there's way more Canadian mining companies in Africa than there are in China. The issue, or than Chinese companies, the issue is that there's an interesting relation here, which is that China uses its mining companies, which are primarily state-owned enterprises, as a way to secure raw materials for production within China. Okay, that's something that happened, obviously, by the British. They did that, et cetera, et cetera. However, the profit motive is absent there. So this is why when a state-owned enterprise is tasked by the Chinese state with securing raw materials, they're not tasked with securing raw materials with the highest rate of profit to pay out shareholders, unlike Canadian mining corporations. So because of that, they are able to offer way more preferential deals to certain nations to secure mining deals. Canadian mining companies work with Global Affairs Canada to, for example, rewrite constitutions of African nations to stop the public ownership of natural resources. They basically want to secure the ownership of those resources. Chinese companies do not do that. They allow for public ownership of natural resources, and because they're not looking for profit, they can offer way better prices. They can offer infrastructure deals. They can offer all this stuff because they're just trying to get those raw materials to China for production and development. So the relationship is, okay, let's say it's exploitative. Yes, it is, but it's still like it's extractivist or anything like that. The relationship is far better, and this is why the West is freaking out, and why the Canadian mining companies freak out too, is they simply cannot compete with a Chinese state-owned enterprise. And this is why when you get down to like beyond the moralistic sort of nonsense, and I used to work in agencies that did what do you call it, corporate social development reports for Canadian mining companies, and sometimes you'd meet with Canadian mining like executives, and they would laugh about like what a bunch of bullshit these fucking reports were, because it's just nonsense. So Canadian mining companies are freaking out because and other mining companies, they just can't compete. If your competitor is like, well, I don't need to make a profit, I just need to buy this, and hey, I can build you a railroad, I can do this. Like, what do you want? You want schools? You want infrastructure development? I mean, it's just they can't compete. And so the business press and the Canadian mining companies, when they talk amongst themselves, they don't say, oh, what a poor deal the Africans are getting. No, they say we can't compete with this. This is unfair trade practices. They're using the state. They're doing this like that, as if I don't know, like it's wrong to use the state to do things. Like it's just such a weird argument, but that's what they have in their head. This is what they can't think. So when I hear about these things, the accusations against China and stuff like that, is like, I'm not saying every relationship with China is going to be good, but I'm going to say the possibility that it can be good is there. I do not think that exists whatsoever with Canadian mining corporations at all. I do not think Canadian mining corporations, there's even one in Cuba that works with nickel, I think, and it's I think maybe the only foreign mining company operating in Cuba, because it's a very specific sort of type of nickel or something. I don't think that relationship is necessarily good, but I think it's exploitative too. And I think that just what China offers is the ability for global South countries to have somebody who's better to deal with. Now, those governments too can be shitty to their own population. They could say, yeah, I don't care about the infrastructure development. You want the resources, fine, have the resources, just like give us a bunch of cash. They can totally do that too. That's not necessarily the fault of the Chinese. Should the Chinese then be saying, wait a second, no, we're going to build you a bridge, we're going to do this, we want to do this? Like, is that their place then to like impose a progressive model of development? Like, I don't, yeah. If the thing is, trade has to happen. These things have to happen. Countries have to develop. Offer me another model that you think the Chinese should pursue. Often, I think people just don't understand how state-owned mining companies operate. The sort of like the raw material, that why they can compete. I just think people don't understand it. They think it's just the same as Canadian mining companies, just like they think billionaires in China are the same as billionaires in the West.
Yeah, interesting. And one final note to make then is it safe to say that yeah, I mean, I think you answered it all perfectly, but that China in general has just much more respect for a country's sovereignty. The Chinese people themselves and Chinese businesses and Chinese business leaders themselves may not like whoever is in charge of whatever African country or whatever country in Asia, but rightly or wrongly, they respect the sovereignty of that country, and that's the difference between, as you mentioned, between how Canada flaunts international law by trying to make the Africans sign all these dodgy deals in which they're not allowed to sue corporations for violating human rights laws or anything like that.
Yep.
And any incoming government that wants to say enough of this of Barrett Gold over here can't even change that law because of
Yeah. Yeah. There's just two different things operating. So you can say, yeah, I don't like what the Chinese do. I think they do bad things. I think fundamentally they're a better option than the U.S. Western imperialists. If you want to say they're both imperialists, okay, whatever. Say they're both imperialists. Then say articulate a third model that they should follow. Then I think that's possible. I think you could do it. But I don't hear anybody saying it. They just say, "Oh, they're the same. It's both." They don't look at the actual differences. And I think that's I think it's at some point you've got to. And this is maybe a Western left kind of thing because we're never in power. We're so far away from power. The notion of what socialist construction isn't there, but we're very well versed in critiquing the existing system we're in. So that critique is leveled then everywhere. That seems like the notion of what the left is not an emancipatory project to create socialism. It's a project of just critique, and that's it. And that's I think that leaves many people unable to deal with taking the arguments of others, especially in the global South, that they're engaging in a certain project of socialist construction, and taking that in good faith, and then trying to investigate what's actually happening. Instead, it just goes to this happened with the pink tide and stuff. The progressive governments in South America, which I have critiques of, which many people have critiques of, which was this first flush of wow, they're doing something different than the Cuban model. They're doing something different than the USSR. This is so much better. We love them. I'm Naomi Klein. Hugo Chavez is going to save the world, blah, 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 blah. Time goes on. There's problems with that level of construction. There's problems just inherent and fundamentally what was kind of a social democratic thing. Okay. Those problems pop up. Then it's oh, he's a strong man. He's a dictator. They're doing all this wrong. This is terrible. They're not really good. Don't invade them. That would be bad. But we can see, I think the day of the coup in Bolivia, Naomi Klein was on Twitter going on about this is the problem with Evo Morales is here. Look at this NACLA thing, et cetera. Obviously the coup is bad, but just kind of make an apology for it almost. I don't know. This is just that shit bores me. I don't know enough about the Chinese process to really, and we spent 2 hours talking about it, to really get into it. But I think that we should spend more time just saying what's actually going on and looking at it rather than mounting our critiques at the same time as our ruling class does, and thinking we're better, we're a little more nuanced because it's coming from the left. No, I mean, if you actually care about China or you care about people in China, spend some fucking time learning about it. Unfortunately, I should take my own advice.
On that note, we are joined on this edition of One Plus One, and Jay, I think I think you hit the nail on the head, which is, which is, if you're a lefty and you actually have a huge platform and a following and stuff like that, why are you spending your time, constantly constantly like, in engaging in engaging in so much self-McCarthyism, if you know what I mean? It's like what you were mentioning about like Libya. This is a country under the attack by the Western powers to be, and instead of like just pushing back against like this war for oil, no, instead you're like, yeah, no, Gaddafi needs to go or something like that, or like, yes, we need to do something about like the Uighurs in China and stuff like that. And in the end of the day, every time the powers to be do this, we know what happens. It's always a war based on, based on weapons of mass deception. Yeah.
Yeah. It is. I don't know. So that just, it's frustrating. I think a lot of it is because the Western left is more an academic oriented. It's not even like some of the Western European left. The Social Democratic Party, for example, here doesn't have a Marxist background, unlike the SPD in Germany or Social Democratic parties in your country. The Marxist left is not actively engaged in parties or organizations, tends to be Trotskyite, which has its criticisms of existing socialism, is pretty poor on support for Global South projects, unless they're at the beginning and they seem to be different than what they didn't like before. I don't know. So people, maybe people, especially if you're a professor or something like that at a university, maybe it doesn't seem profitable for your career to like be strictly oppositional, or even to call or to say, okay, I find the substance of the basis of these critiques to be faulty and not worth what they're saying. So I'd like to see something else. Even that is now considered a pretty, I mean, you're called a genocide denier. Even if you're just saying, well, I don't think the proof is there, I'd like to see more. And you're like, well, they don't have the proof because they destroyed the proof. But so like, trust me on this. And like, no, like you're helping gin up World War III. Like, sorry.
Exactly.
Give me some more info.
Well, on this edition, this special 2-hour edition on 1+1, we were joined by the brilliant Jay Watts, central organizer of the Communist Party of Canada, on this special all-China edition. This is actually going to be the first of many special interviews that I'm organizing with Jay. The next time I hope to get Jay back on, we're going to talk about the Korean War and the two Koreas post Korea War, and Jay is going to help us demystify and debunk some of the some of the half truths and bullshit propaganda on North Korea. And we already touched a bit about South Korea, but that's going to be for another time. And I'm hoping to get Jay back on in the future to talk about Vietnam and so forth. But we're going to leave it there. Jay, thank you so much for spending much of your Friday evening with me on 1+1. Thank you so much for this. I'll make sure to send me the link to that comrade of yours who's the Asia one. And thank you so much for joining us. And I look forward to having you back on in the future.
Thank you for having me. It's great.